So I invite you to join me in prayer. Loving God, thanks for bringing us together today in this time. Thank you for the respite of the week off. I pray that it was a time of recharging and renewal for all of us. Well, we are so glad that you have brought us together in community to look at your word and to glean meaning from it and to build community among ourselves. Be with our friends who are in absentia tonight. Open our hearts and our minds to receive the good news and the truth that you have for us this day. Be with our friends who are ailing and sick, particularly our friends who just received word about a diagnosis. Calm their fears and let them know your presence in their life and shower them with your grace and healing. And be with the hurting in our world in this time and guide us by your grace. This we pray in your Son's holy name, and all of God's children said, Amen. Yeah, so last time we were at 8 and 9. Anything that folks would like to ask or share or refresh? I'm not gonna lie, I didn't re-look at 8 and 9 before we started, but I'll do my best. Bruce, you have a question or a comment?
I got stuck on a question about fasting, which is in chapter 9, verse 14.
Yeah, tell me, what's your question?
Well, I was wondering what does the fasting have to do with the bridegroom and
Oh,
yeah, so I thought,
oh,
well, this is what he's, after I got to thinking, Jesus is saying, and the old ways of doing things are really not relevant anymore. You need to look at new ways of doing things, like you put new wine in new wineskins and
right.
yeah, but for at least an hour, I couldn't figure out what that was telling me. Yeah.
Well, let me add just a layer of, and there's no reason why you would know this. So in ancient Jewish law, the fasting rules do not apply to the bride and groom for the weeks heading into a wedding. So the wedding is planned and a fast day occurs within that 21 days before the wedding takes place. The bride and groom are exempt from having to do the fasting. So in some ways, Jesus is saying, while I am with you, it's like this extended time of joy and preparation for this, for this event, because I am the bridegroom, right? And so while I am with you, so I agree with what you said, but then there's that other, that kind of like next level of sort of insider information, which but like, trust me, I had to read that. I didn't know that myself. So I mean, I did that. That was research for me. So that's what he's kind of saying, is that it's this extended period of time of joy and preparation for this celebration. That's what it's like with me being in your presence. We're in this extended 21 days getting ready for this wonderful celebration while I'm here. So there's that level to it as well. Yeah, I don't think I said that last time, and I meant to bring that up. So I'm glad you asked that question. That was good. Any other questions or comments about 8 and 9 before we jump to 8, 9 and 10, 11 and 12?
Hello.
So just a little recap from the very first class, which we didn't know. Chapter 10 is the second discourse. So I mentioned to you in the first class that Matthew is organized around 5 discourses. The first discourse we've already gone over, that was the Sermon on the Mount. That was chapter 5, 6, and 7. And chapter 10 is the second discourse, which is commonly referred to as like on discipleship, right? And we know that it's one of the discourses because hopefully by now we have recognized the common phrase that Matthew uses to distinguish that we're just in a discourse, which is chapter 11, verse 1. Now when Jesus had finished. Every time we see that line in the gospel, it's repeated 5 times in the Gospel of Matthew. Every time we see that line, we are aware that that which has preceded it is one of the discourses. And we believe that Matthew had a resource that he used that was a collection of sayings and stories about Jesus. We're going to get to another discourse here soon, which are the parables that Matthew uses, which is pretty soon, right after this. But all of chapter 10 is a discourse. And so, like I said, we thematically kind of call that like on discipleship. And we know, and the reason why it's called like on discipleship is chapter 10 begins with Jesus, with Matthew naming the 12 disciples for the very first time. And so we have the Matthew's version of the list, which is slightly different from the list in Mark, which is slightly different from the list in Luke, which is slightly different from the list in what's called the Didache, which again was part of that recommended, not required reading for early Christians. And again, people, it would be very interesting in terms of this apologetics study Bible if they try to make sense of the list of names, because some people are so uncomfortable with the list being different that they try to make sense of it by saying, oh, this is what it really means and everything like that. What you really want to know is there are a lot of commonalities in the lists. Peter, Andrew, James and John, Matthew, Thomas, but the one they all agree on, and he gets listed this way every time, is Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. So it's very fascinating to me. There's not, I mean, there's a lot, but each four of the Gospels are so different from each other in so many ways. The Easter stories are different. The baptism stories are different.
Christmas story.
The Christmas stories. Some don't even have Christmas stories, right? They're so different from each other. But when they agree on something, man, I always want to make sure that we like really highlight it. And from the earliest tradition of the church, Judas, they want to make sure that everyone kind of knows that this is like Judas. This is what Judas did. He gets known, he gets labeled the betrayer almost immediately. And it must have been such a traumatic moment in the early life of the church to have an insider betray Jesus. And to the point where Dante, if you've read Dante's Inferno, or even just read the cliff notes of Dante's Inferno, you don't even have to really have read Dante's Inferno. But does anyone remember how Satan is portrayed in Dante's Inferno? Portrayed as a three-headed dragon. And the faces of Satan in Dante's Inferno, the three faces, are the three betrayers of Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. So the great betrayers of history, right, are the three faces of Satan according to Dante's Inferno. So I mean, that's how bad gets it, right? So anyway, that being said, there actually is an apocryphal gospel of Judas. Has anyone looked at that or read about that at all? So it's very fascinating. We actually have about 80% of that gospel preserved, and it's been translated into English, and you can get on your favorite bookstore and order a copy of the Gospel of Judas. The Gospel of Judas says that Judas is the second most important person in the story. And he's the second bravest or most courageous person in the story. And that if Judas doesn't do what Judas does, Jesus never gets arrested. Jesus never gets crucified. Jesus never gets resurrected. And so the gospel sort of venerates Judas for his betrayal and his actions. And he does so willingly, knowing what he will be labeled as later. Which is sort of, if you watch Jesus Christ Superstar, a lot of the ways that Judas gets portrayed in Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical.
Mhm.
So anyway, I thought I'd point that out to you. So the rest of we spent a lot of time on that. I didn't mean to spend that much time on that. There's something that actually kind of matters now. So I listed 5 things I went through here, and Jesus sends his disciples out, these 12, out with these instructions, and it's really wordy, so I just kind of narrowed it down for you. There's 5 things that they get sent out with, and these are paraphrases. But the first is go to the Jewish people. So they're not the Gentiles. They're not to go to the Samaritans. They're supposed to go to their own. There's a little bit of an interpretation on what the lost tribes of Israel means, whether that means all Jewish people or just the everyday citizens. And don't go to the power players, don't go to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the temple people, but go to, so there's a little bit of debate on what the lost tribes of Israel means a little bit. 2 is do what I've been doing. He gives them instruction to do the very things that through the first 9 chapters of Matthew, we've seen Jesus do, which is heal, cast out demons, heal the sick, cure the sick, those type of things. The things that he tells them to do are the things that they have been seeing him do. He is not asking them to do anything that they have not already seen him do. 3, they are to receive no payment for, they're supposed to do this because they are called to do this, and they're not to receive any payment. They're also 4, rely on the hospitality of others. Which, one, that is a very tried and true Jewish first century custom, that they were to welcome the stranger, welcome the foreigner, house the refugee. That it's that old, we were once a stranger in a strange land. Now you pay that forward. But also it's an act of trust and faith in God will provide. Give us this day our daily bread, sort of thing. And then last, and I love this one, bless those who help you and roll with it when people don't. So we get a nice little first century colloquialism about shaking the dust off your feet. Has anyone heard maybe a more, more contemporary colloquialism to that? To shaking the dust off your feet? It's like let the water roll off a duck's back. Yeah, it's just let it roll. Like just don't carry it with you. Some people are just not going to receive you the way you want to. Don't take it personally. Just roll with it. But those are the 5 instructions, which is
It's a lot. I mean,
it is a lot.
when I listened to it, and I'm sitting there thinking like, okay, well, wait a minute here. What about this and what about that? I mean, it's a lot for a group of 12 sitting there with a diverse group saying, okay, you want me to do this? You want me to do that? So you explained the hospitality thing, but I gotta believe, considering these are probably younger people. Well, yeah, they've got a few questions, I would imagine.
Again, like with Matthew, we don't get a lot of back and forth, or what were they thinking, sort of thing. But I take solace, John, in the fact that like Jesus doesn't ask them to do anything that he hasn't already shown them how to do. Like a good coach, I've shown you how to do this. Now you go do this, sort of thing. And what's interesting is he sends them off, and then in chapter 11. He goes on his own way. Like he doesn't sit around waiting for them to get back. Like he just when you get back, he just sort of does his thing. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's something to be said about that. There are definitely things that are easier said than done. Rely on the hospitality of others sounds good until you don't receive hospitality.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of, I guess anything today, even your kids or whatever, they're gonna, well, wait a minute here, you want me to go out and do this and do that and do this, I mean, yeah.
All about myself?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yes, right, and this is
Leave
not,
my phone here and what?
yeah, right. And this isn't, notice, this isn't, he doesn't say go by 2 by 2. That's a whole other story, right? That's the commissioning of the 70. That's when they go off in pairs. So we don't know if they're going off. Are they all going together? You know what I mean? Are they all 12 going together? Are they splitting up? We don't have that detail. So it could be everything from they're going off by themselves to they're going off as a group.
But he also tells them, you're gonna have some trouble.
Yeah.
He does.
Yeah.
Right, and so that's the next
It's
bit,
not gonna
right?
be a walk in the park.
So think about, I thought about it as a coach, right? As someone who's received coaching often and mentorship from wonderful people, from playing Little League baseball all the way up to great mentors who still help me when I need help as a pastor today. And the first thing he does is give them instruction, and the next thing he does is give them encouragement. And you're right, he does say, like, this isn't gonna be easy, but you can do this, right? And you can do this because, God is with you, I've prepared you. And he gives them some advice, which I think is really great. The wise as serpents and the innocent as dove really translates to be cunning, be brave, be persistent, but also be non-threatening, be peaceful, be non-violent. There's some really be receiving like a dove, be non-threatening like a dove, but also kind of protect yourself and don't be afraid to, do what you need to do to get out of a situation like a snake. And so there's, he gives them this encouragement. And then there's a next level to this, which is not just Jesus telling this to those disciples, but Matthew's readers hearing this in their context. So all you have to do is read the book of Acts to know that first generation of Christians were being persecuted. Everything that Matthew has Jesus mention here about, see, I'm sending you to the wolves. You will be handed over to the councils. You'll be flogged. You'll be sent before governors and kings. All of these things are the very things, chapter 10, verse 23, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. Tell me that doesn't sound like Paul and Luke and Barnabas and things. And so who really does have Jesus really name the context that the first century readers of these instructions are receiving. So this encouragement is not just for those 12 disciples, but it's also meant for the church, right? And so be brave, be persistent, be courageous, don't give in, these things were going to happen. Right? You were prepared for this. You can do this. That's why it sounded like a coach to me. You're now going to play the best team out there. They're going to hit you hard. Don't worry, you can get back up, right? The old Rocky thing. What's the Rocky Balboa quote? It's not how hard you hit, it's how hard you can get hit, get knocked down, get back up and keep going. Like that's Rocky Balboa. And so, yes, so he's, I feel like it's very coaching. Were there any verses that jumped out at you? Any other verses? Because there's some famous verses in chapter 10, and I didn't know if there was any teachings of Jesus that you wanted a little bit more. Because one of my favorite verses is in this chapter, but I wanted to see if there was maybe ones that jumped out at you.
Well, the one that says not a face but a sword, not peace but a sword.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't come here I came here to cause trouble.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that scripture has sometimes been twisted to give justification for crusades and such, Bruce, which I don't think is an accurate reading of that. I think you're hitting it more on the head that in the context of that with, I haven't come to bring peace, I've come to bring a sword to set a son against a father, a daughter against a mother, that kind of thing. Again, that was happening in real time in people's lives in the first century, where a household became divided because this household member started following the Christian, starting the Christian way and stuff. And so those conflicts were happening, and those times weren't peaceful. And I can just say, like, it's not peaceful. It's not always peaceful to try to live a life that I feel like Jesus calls us to live. It can really cause a lot. It can cause your blood pressure to go up. So it's hard. It's really hard. There are moments of it that are hard, but there's also moments of joy and everything. It's multifaceted, obviously. Any other? That's a good one. That is a tough one to sometimes think about. Anybody else have another interpretation of that, or an idea or meaning found in that about the sword? And I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring, because we think of Jesus as like the Prince of Peace and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, my Bible has chapter 11, verse 28, almost touching. So 11, verse 28, come to me, all of you weary and carry your burdens, and I will give you peace and rest.
Yeah.
So they're both touching the, one's touching the other one.
Yeah, for sure. It's multifaceted, right?
Yeah.
It's shocking that that spiritual teachings are complicated and don't necessarily always they're not monolithic or monochromatic, right? They're colorful and diverse and everything. I've got I one of my favorite, but anybody else have a favorite one that jumps out at them? So one of my favorite verses is verse 39, chapter 10, verse 39. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will find it. That's been is what? It is a tough one. Do y'all know who Richard Rohr is?
Yeah.
Yes.
I love Richard Rohr's take on this scripture verse. He talks about the more you reduce your own ego, then it creates space within you for Christ to fill you up with a new life, but you have to first be willing to do the work to diminish your own ego. And that's how he interprets verse 39. Always like that. That's really the purpose of it. And one of my good friends who's a priest, Catholic priest, he talks about that's one of the interpretations of the Eucharist. And one of the reasons why Catholics talk about transubstantiation and the Eucharist becoming the actual, body of Christ sort of thing, is that what you're doing is you're consuming the life force, and so that your whole body is sort of being filled with the life force of Jesus. And I'm like, gosh, if that's the way like transubstantiation had been like explained to me, that's such a beautiful idea, that through communion you're filling yourself up with Christ, so that then you can go out and be that Christ to someone else. Like, it's like, what a beautiful idea. As a Protestant, that's not what we talk about. But I like this idea of ego, reducing ego and filling yourself up with Christ. So anyway, that's one of my favorite ones. I think about that one quite a bit. It is tough though.
But I'll tell you, when I take the body of the bread, that's one of the things I pray for, is that it fills me, fills all my holes.
Yeah. Look at you, your inner Catholic coming out in you, John.
He's a big pound of water.
Yeah, right. Any other scriptures? Like I said, there's some good stuff in top 10. I don't want to go through it quickly. Yeah, okay. So then chapter 11, it really gets split up in two halves, chapter 11. The first half is on John the Baptist, and then the second half is Jesus giving some harsh criticism to his contemporaries, which he was wont to do every so often, is to bring some things, bring some criticisms and words to his contemporaries, and so you get this, so you get some John the Baptist talk. So, but I want, before I jump into John the Baptist real quick, I want to point out to you chapter 11, verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished, again, that's Matthew's sign that the discourse has ended and we're changing topics. He went from there, and so you have to kind of go back to say, well, where was he? You know, but he goes from wherever he was to teach and to proclaim his message in their cities. There is the hometowns of the disciples, the 12 disciples. So which basically means it's shorthand for the region of Galilee. That's basically where he is, in the north. And it's just really good to remember that all of Jesus's early disciples, his most trusted, companions, all came from that region. And there was a rivalry between Galilee and Judah in the south, which is one reason why Jesus is somewhat ridiculed by the big city folk in Jerusalem, sort of thing. There is this sort of rural city rivalry that goes way back. It's present today. You will see the rivalry play itself out on November 5th. Just look at that map, and it is city versus rural. I mean, gosh, it really is. And that old rivalry between, city folk and country folk,
It's a good business.
it goes. John, on the other hand, he did a lot of his ministry outside of urban areas. And because he was in Judah, he wasn't that far from Jerusalem. It says in, chapter 3, when we get introduced to John, that everyone came out to see him. So he really had more of an urban ministry going on about him. And if you wanted to know where John was imprisoned, all you have to do is look to Josephus. And so tradition has that John was imprisoned in Machaerus, Macherus, Machaerus, which was 5 miles east of the Dead Sea. And it's basically a maximum security prison.
My grandparents, grandmother is
Prison. Herod wasn't.
I don't understand.
Remember why why John was arrested? Does anyone remember? John was arrested because he preached against the corruption of Herod and his immorality for marrying his aunt. And so, I'm sorry, not his aunt, his brother's wife. That's what it was. His brother's wife. It wasn't his aunt. It was his brother's wife. And so John lays into Herod. And Herod goes, all right, then we can't have this. And so Herod has John arrested and thrown in, like I said, basically a maximum security prison, and eventually is beheaded. Right? I think most of us know that he's beheaded, but this is a political person in power, not appreciating someone giving him the business, and he has him arrested. But John's disciples are still working. And so, and they're visiting John in prison. And John has his disciples come and find Jesus and ask him if he's the Messiah. Does Jesus answer the question? No. Jesus doesn't answer the question. And
That's a question.
Jesus says, tell John what you have seen. There's a theory as to why Jesus does not give a direct answer to John, which is, it would have gotten back to Herod that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah, and then Jesus himself would have been arrested before, well, he eventually gets arrested anyway, but before that. And so there's this, he uses coded language to sort of get the message back to John. He doesn't deny or affirm the question. Instead, he says, tell John what you've seen. And if you look at that list, it's the same, except for the release of the captives. It's a direct quote from Isaiah, which is what Isaiah says will happen during the Messianic age. In Luke, Jesus includes release of the captives, but in Matthew he doesn't. He doesn't include that. So John says, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus answers by saying, "Tell him what you have seen. These are the things you've seen," which is a clear sign that the Messianic age has come. So he answers it with this, in a non-answer. A lot of ways to protect himself. But then he goes on and he lauds John and he gives John all sorts of kudos, telling everybody how great John is. But notice he says, even though as great as John is, all of you who follow me are even greater than that. But he also gives the sense that John is the harbinger of the Messianic age, calls him Elijah, connects John to the prophecy that Elijah will return to bring in the Messianic age, and so really gives John a lot of kudos, and says just nothing but really great things about John. But then it takes a turn, which I absolutely love. So, chapter 11, verse 12. I'm sorry, verse 16. But what will I compare this generation? Y'all are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, but you didn't dance. We wailed and you didn't mourn for us. So basically what Jesus is saying is, y'all want the show, but I'm not here to put on a show for you. John wasn't here to put on a show for you. We've got something much more important than the show. And it's, and when John didn't put on the show that you wanted him to do, you called him insane. You said that he had a demon. When I won't put the show on you, put on the show for you, you call me a drunkard, and and you call me a friend of tax collector. You insult me, but he doesn't. He's not very happy with. I've got a friend who's a comedian in LA, almost he auditioned for Saturday Night Live to be a writer on Saturday Night Live, didn't get it, but he's a pretty good comedian. And every once in a while I've been in his company and someone finds out that he's a comedian and they're just like, be funny. And he's like, I'm just here to hang out. I'm not here this idea. And then they're like, oh, how can you be a comedian? You're not, I don't think you're very funny. And it's not, you can't just turn it on. And then of course he gets pissed and then he turns it on. And he basically roasts the people who were giving him a hard time. It's kind of what Jesus is doing. They're like, be funny. And he's like, I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to do something much more serious than entertain you. But they just really want the entertainment, which then if you pay attention later on in chapter 12, the Pharisees and the scribes, chapter 12, verse 13, then some scribes and Pharisees said, hey, teacher, show us a sign. And, and Jesus is like, I'm not showing you a sign, like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing this on your command. I'm not here to be at your beck and call and to do this dog and pony show for you. But he has a different tune. But notice he has a different tune when someone who's really suffering, who's really hurting, and they come for his help. He has nothing but compassion for them. And I can't think of a single time in the gospel that Jesus sends away somebody who's hurting, suffering, and says like, no, I'm not going to help you. But if you come to him and say, hey, do the thing, he was like, I'm not here for that. I'm not here for that. Instead, Jesus says, what I am here for is, oh, before I get to what I am here for, he does a very prophetic thing. Chapter 11, verse 20. He goes through the woes. So when we did woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, woe to you, Tyre and Sidon, woe to you, Capernaum. He does the list of woes on the cities. And I really want you to separate out the city versus the people. I think, and these are his people, right? This is his region. This is where he grew up. I feel like it's the same as me giving Texas a hard time. Like, I love the people of Texas. There are so many great people in Texas. But Texas does some really dumb things. And they just drive me crazy. So I give Texas a hard time, but I really love them. And the people there, they have such kind hearts. There's so many good people in Texas. So I always think of that when Jesus is doing the woes to these cities. Obviously, it's people who are coming to asking him for help are from these cities. We need to differentiate between the two. But woe, that's what I was going to say. Woe is the opposite or the antonym, the antithesis of blessed. So if blessed is God's favor, woe is God's disfavor. So you can reread these as God's disfavor upon you, Chorazin. God's disfavor be upon you, Bethsaida. And so that's a very prophetic thing to do. Isaiah does the woes. Jeremiah does the woes. Jeremiah's woes are more personal. Woe to me, God says, but Isaiah, he actually gives woes to nations and stuff. That woe thing, though, is a very prophetic, Jewish prophetic sort of thing to do. But then Jesus says, he concludes this time with the beautiful, beautiful call. So he woes the cities, but then he calls the people who are downtrodden and suffering and weary, to embrace. And so that's a really beautiful thing. Is there anything that maybe, when you read those words, is there anything in our country that jumps out at you?
From 28.
Yeah, when you read 28, come to me all who are weary and carry heavy burden.
Sounds like a Statue of
It
Liberty.
does sound like the Statue of Liberty, doesn't it? Yeah, bring me your.
Huddled masses.
Yeah.
Tired huddled masses.
Yeah. So it does sound like the statue. To me, it does. It sounds like what is on the Statue of Liberty. And so that's chapter 12. And then so again, chapter 12 or chapter 11 can really be broken almost in half. There's the praise of John the Baptist, and then there's the chastisement of his home region. Is just exacerbation with his home region. And then it concludes with this beautiful teaching that it's just a call to to the comfort and grace and it's good to, that's good to read every so often. Chapter 11, 28 through 30, just to remind ourselves. Which is the exact opposite. I don't think we've read in Matthew, which is different from the narrow path. Oh, I guess maybe we did do the narrow path a couple of weeks ago, right? And so it's that both and approach, right? My path is hard, it's narrow. Not everybody can do it. Come to me, my yoke is easy. Take on, let me ease your burden. That kind of thing. It's a multifaceted way of looking at the spiritual life and following of Jesus. That complexity, I think, speaks to the depth and the real power of the faith. So chapter 12, I find chapter 12 to be a very fascinating chapter, and hopefully you did as well. So it all takes place on one day. And reading chapter 12, I would say one very exhausting day. It's and so somehow Jesus' disciples get back to him. We don't know how, it doesn't say, and they returned or anything like that. But at some point, his disciples come back to him and they're hungry. And so they're walking through a field. It's on the Sabbath, and they start to pick the wheat, or the grain. And I guess it doesn't say it's wheat. And which actually, I guess if you pluck wheat, you can't really just eat wheat, can you? You have to like grind it and like add water and cook it, right? You can't just. Anyway, so whatever heads of the grain that they're picking, not wheat, they begin to eat it. The Pharisees see them. Okay, I don't know this time around in this gospel if I've explained the Pharisees to you or not, but if not, let me just do it very, very quickly. The Pharisees believe in the kingdom of God. The Pharisees believe in the Messianic age. They're waiting for the Messiah to come. They believe that the pathway to the kingdom of God being established on earth, the necessary steps to bring about the Messianic age, is to fully comply with the commandments. But not only that, but also the hundreds of interpretations that have come down through the tradition on how to understand the commandments. The way I like to think about it is the American tax code. Like, the layperson just can't understand it. And there's the tax code, and then there's all the interpretations of the tax codes, and then they've been adjusted, they've been things, and so you have to hire a professional to help you. And even then, they sometimes struggle. Jesus is basically saying, like, this has gotten to be too much. And you're losing the forest for the trees, sort of thing. So let's get back to the heart of it, which is, the love principle, the love ethic, the belief, the trust, that kind of thing. And it's so the Pharisees, I always like to point out that the Pharisees and Jesus actually do have a lot in common. If they were concentric circles, they would really overlap a lot. They just have a different way of getting there. And so their upsetness with the disciples and their interpretation breaking the Sabbath law is, if you don't keep the Sabbath, the Messiah can't come. The kingdom of God can't be established. It's not that they're just jerks. Like, they really do feel like this is a really important step in getting to what they ultimately see as the good. What's interesting is the disciples actually don't break the Sabbath law, because the Torah clearly states that a person who is hungry has the right to pick something and eat it. So they don't break the actual, but they're so convoluted around their interpretation of they're even missing the whole point, right? Same thing with the healing of the man's hand. The Sabbath, the Torah clearly states that to heal someone who is hurting is on the Sabbath is not a violation of the Sabbath, because in Jewish tradition, life is the highest value. And someone being in pain and that diminishment of their quality of life and their restoration to life is a higher value than keeping the Sabbath law. And so basically what the word that I like to use for the Pharisees is they've become fundamentalists, and there is no grace in their understanding of their own scriptures. So anyway, that's where the Pharisees are, and they so none of the things that they're chastising Jesus about is actually Jesus, and the disciples aren't actually doing anything against the law, against the Torah. But in the Pharisees' eyes, they're so myopic in their interpretation of their own scriptures that like it lost the true meaning of it. Things I'd like to point out in verse 22. If you go to verse 22, so then they brought, same day, it's still the Sabbath. Then they brought Jesus, a person with a demonic spirit. The person, not the demonic, not the demon, but the person is blind and is mute. And Jesus, cured the man, the person, so that he could speak and he could see. I want to point out that this is a classic example of spiritual health and physical health being seen as almost one and the same, to the point where if you look at this exact same story in the Gospel of Luke, same thing comes. Has a demon, is mute and blind. Luke says Jesus exorcises the demon and the person can see and speak. Here it says Jesus cures him and he can see. So that spiritual health and that physical health are seen as intimately linked with one another and aren't separated out like the way we kind of. So that sort of mind, body, spirit idea is very inherent in the first century world. It's really kind of a post-enlightenment. We got really rational in the Enlightenment, and we started separating out physical health from mental health, from spiritual health, and we didn't see all those things connected the way that our ancestors did in the first century. And I like to think we're getting better at that now in the 21st century. I think we actually have a more first century understanding of that than we did sort of in the 1700s to maybe the 20th century. Maybe we're getting better at it in the late 20th and early 21st century. So then, last but certainly not least, because we're right on time, is I always like to point out that not only the Pharisees missing the point, not only are they getting so myopic in their understanding of their own scriptures, which again is a very fundamentalist thing to do, is then they get fixated on the act and they miss the whole point of it. And again, I'd like to point out Richard Rohr here, who has been so helpful for me to understand the miracles. So what the Pharisees end up trying to do is explain how Jesus performed the miracle. And Richard Rohr has helped me understand that understanding how the miracle happens is missing the point of the miracle altogether. That the miracle has two real points. Jesus performed miracles for two reasons. One is to point us to God, and two is to restore a person. And that's the real point. If we're trying to figure out how he actually did it, we're actually missing the whole point of it altogether. We're focusing on the wrong thing. If we're trying, in our rational 21st century scientific mind, if we're trying to figure out how he did it, we've already missed the point of the miracle.
Makes me think of all the miracles of the people that he raised. What was he restoring them to? I mean, it's create a image in your mind.
Yeah, well, community, right? That this Sunday, I'm preaching this Sunday on blind Bartimaeus. It happens to be the election. And one of the things that jumped out at me about blind Bartimaeus, which is a healing miracle, is now Bartimaeus has the dignity to have self-agency. He's no longer reliant on the kindness of strangers for his subsistence. He can actually, and what worth that brings to a person to I can actually take care of myself now. That's huge. That brings such self-worth. And that was such an understated benefit of the miracle, but that could be so powerful for the person, right? And so the restoration restores. It's so multifaceted, the restoration, John, and so I think sometimes we miss that in the miracle stories, all the layers of that restoration and the benefits of the healing. But Richard Rohr, I've sort of been on a Richard Rohr kick. I can't recommend Richard Rohr enough to folks. I'm reading his book on the connection between the Christian tradition and 12-step programs. It's called Breathing. I found it so good. But anyway, he's really helped me understand The Naked Now. Has anyone read The Naked Now? That's one of my favorite Richard Rohr books too. And he talks about missing the miracle. In The Naked Now, he talks about missing the miracle all the time. And he points out because we get so fixated on how we miss the why and the power of it. So anyway, I got some more things on 12, but we're at an hour. So I really appreciate y'all. Thanks for joining me today. Hopefully you learned
What
something.
chapter we cover next week?
Well, we'll finish up 12, Donna, but then we're on, I think, 13, 14,
50.
and 15. Yeah, thanks, John. 13, 14, 15. Hopefully they're not as dense. But have a wonderful time, and God bless you and Godspeed. Thanks, everybody.